My father gave my lazy brother a fortune and gave me a cheap plastic toy. He told me I didn't need help. He's right. I don't need his money, but he's about to find out how much he needs my mercy. Before we see how I turn $2 into ultimate freedom, please take a moment to hit like and tell me in the comments, how is the weather where you are today? I hope you're keeping warm and safe. Now, let's step into my world. Here, Leo, you need to build an image for your new venture, my father said, his voice brimming with a solemnity that made the leather BMW key fob in his hand look like a royal scepter. We were standing in the living room of our Connecticut home, the scent of expensive Fraser fur filling the air. Yet the atmosphere felt as structurally unsound as a building with a cracked foundation. I watched as my brother's hands trembled with a staged humility that didn't quite hide his smug triumph, his fingers closing around the silver emblem of a vehicle that cost more than my entire first year's salary as a structural engineer. My father, Arthur, beamed at him, ignoring the fact that this was Leo's fourth failed business attempt in 5 years, funded entirely by the Bank of Dad. It was a performance of favoritism so blatant it felt like a physical weight in the room. Then, my father turned to me, his expression shifting from pride to a thin, patronizing smile that told me exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. He didn't reach for a velvet box or a signed envelope. Instead, he pulled a cheap, translucent pink plastic piggy bank from behind the tree, the kind you buy for a toddler at a neighborhood pharmacy. He placed it in my hands with a light pat on my shoulder, claiming that because I was always the stable one, who always had my life together, I didn't need the same level of support as my brother. He called it a symbolic gesture of the thriftiness that made me so successful, his tone suggesting I should be honored by the insult. Through the thin, flimsy plastic, I could see 2 lonely $1 bills folded at the bottom. $2. The exact price my father had placed on 30 years of my loyalty, my straight A's, and the thousands of dollars I had quietly funneled back into this house to fix the very roof over his head. I didn't scream, and I didn't let a single tear fall. I simply practiced the silence of the abyss, observing the scene with the cold, analytical eye of a woman who calculates stresses and strains for a living. I looked at the plastic pig in my lap, then at Leo, who was already busy snapping photos of his new car for social media, completely oblivious to the wreckage of our family's integrity sitting 3 feet away. My father stood there looking incredibly pleased with himself, as if he had just delivered a profound lesson in character building rather than a declaration of emotional bankruptcy. He saw a daughter who was a fixed asset, someone who required zero maintenance and offered infinite returns, a convenient safety net for when his golden son inevitably crashed another expensive toy. In that moment, the clarity was deafening. The foundation of the Collins family was riddled with dry rot, and I was done being the only one holding the beams together. I felt the cold, cheap plastic against my palms and realized that these $2 weren't a gift. They were my severance pay from a life of being taken for granted. The Christmas dinner that followed was a masterclass in American suburban entitlement, a theater of the absurd where the script had been written long before I was born. The roast beef was tender, The table was set with the fine china I had spent 3 hours polishing the night before, and the conversation was as jagged as a broken glass. Leo held court at the center of the table, his face flushed with the kind of unearned confidence that only a brand new luxury vehicle and a father's blind adoration can provide. He talked about horsepower, leather interiors, and the prestige he would now command in his next business venture, which was apparently some vague consulting firm that required a $60,000 German car to be taken seriously. My father, Arthur, sat at the head of the table, nodding with a reflected glory in his eyes, occasionally glancing at me only when his wine glass needed a refill or the bread basket was out of reach. He treated me like a reliable piece of dated furniture, useful, perhaps even necessary for the room's function, but entirely unremarkable and certainly not worth a second thought. I watched them with the cold, analytical eye of a structural engineer, realizing that I was the only thing in this room actually holding the weight of their world together. For 30 years, I had been the load-bearing wall of the Collins family, absorbing every financial tremor and every emotional outburst with a silence that they mistook for contentment. I had watched Leo fail upward, supported by a safety net woven from my own sacrifices, while my father viewed my independence not as a success to be celebrated, but as a reason to ignore me. As Leo bragged about his future empire, I realized that the foundation of this house wasn't just cracked, it was hollow. There was no depth to their gratitude, no structural integrity to their love. I felt a strange, crystalline clarity settle over me as the dinner dragged on. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is volatile and unpredictable, and as a builder, I prefer things that are solid and measurable. I looked at the translucent pink piggy bank sitting on the sideboard, catching the light from the chandelier, and I knew that the stability my father so admired was about to become his greatest liability. I wasn't running away from a home. I was removing the support beams from a condemned building that refused to acknowledge it was falling down. 2 o'clock in the morning in Connecticut has a specific kind of silence, a heavy, muffled quiet that comes with a fresh layer of December snow. I moved through my room with the methodical precision of a site inspector, my movements rhythmic and quiet. I didn't pack my entire life. I only took what was structurally essential: my professional certifications, my degrees from Georgia Tech, and a few heirlooms that hadn't been tainted by my father's narrow worldview. I moved through the dark hallway, the floorboards groaning under my boots like they were protesting my departure. I went down to the kitchen, where the remains of the festive dinner had been cleared away, leaving only the cold, sterile smell of lemon-scented cleaner. I walked to the mahogany dining table and placed that cheap plastic piggy bank exactly in the center, right where my father usually sat. Beside it, I didn't leave a tearful letter or a long-winded explanation. Instead, I left a simple, professional sticky note on the pig's head with 2 words written in my clearest architectural script: Final Inspection. It was the only report I owed them, a formal notice that I was no longer responsible for maintaining a structure that chose to ignore its own decay. The biting air hit my lungs like a shock of truth as I stepped out onto the porch, the world around me painted in shades of midnight blue and pristine white. I climbed into my old, reliable SUV, a vehicle I had researched, negotiated for, and paid for with my own hard-earned salary, and felt the engine hum to life, a steady vibration that felt like a heartbeat of my own making. I looked back at the house one last time, seeing it for what it truly was, a beautiful facade held up by a daughter who had finally decided to build something for herself. I didn't feel guilt or hesitation. I felt the immense, terrifying freedom of a woman who had just redesigned her own destiny. I put the car in gear and pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching through the fresh white powder as I turned toward the highway. My GPS was already set for San Francisco, 3,000 miles away, a city famous for its resilience and its ability to rebuild after the earth shakes. I was leaving the ruins of Connecticut behind, heading toward a horizon where the only foundations I would have to worry about were the ones I chose to lay myself. The highway stretches out like a dark ribbon under the Nevada moon, the rhythmic thrum of the tires against the asphalt acting as a metronome for the memories I have spent a decade trying to reinforce. In my line of work, we talk about structural integrity, the ability of a frame to hold weight without buckling. But I realize now that my family's foundation was poured with a fatal mix of bias and neglect from the very beginning. I remember 18 as if it were yesterday, not 15 years ago. It was the summer after high school graduation, a time when most kids were dreaming of freedom. Leo had spent his senior year barely scraping by with mediocre averages and a social calendar that would exhaust a politician. Yet, on graduation day, my father handed him a round-trip ticket to Paris and a monthly stipend that could have paved a small road. My father called it an investment in worldly perspective, claiming that a man like Leo needed to see the architecture of the old world to build his own future. When I asked about my own college fund, the one I had been promised for years, my father sat me down in that same mahogany-paneled library. He did not look me in the eye. He looked at his ledger. He told me that as a woman, I needed to cultivate humility, and that my primary role would eventually be to support a household, whereas a man needed a career to lead one. "Elena," he had said, his voice flat and final, "women are the mortar, men are the bricks. You will find a way. You are the resilient one." I did find a way, but it was not the path of a mortar girl. While Leo was sipping espresso on the Champs-Élysées, I was working double shifts at a greasy diner on the edge of town and taking a second job at a local hardware store to pay for my own engineering degree. I can still smell the cloying scent of deep fryer oil that seemed to seep into my very pores, a stark contrast to the sterile, precise world of structural engineering I craved. I spent my nights tucked under a thin blanket, studying calculus and physics by the flickering light of a battery-powered flashlight, because I did not want to increase the electric bill my father constantly complained about. I learned to calculate the load-bearing capacity of steel beams, while my own back ached from standing for 12 hours. My father saw my exhaustion as proof of my noble character, while he saw Leo's postcards from the Louvre as proof of his potential greatness. It was the first time I noticed the rusted beams in our family structure. I was being forged in the fire of manual labor and academic rigor, while Leo was being gold-plated, shiny on the outside, but structurally hollow on the inside. The inequality was not just financial. It was a systematic erasure of my efforts. Every time I brought home an A from the state university I paid for myself, it was met with a distracted, "That is nice, dear." But when Leo returned from France with 0 credits and a closet full of designer clothes he could not afford, my father threw him a welcome home party that cost more than my tuition for the entire semester. I remember standing in the kitchen, washing the dishes from that very party, listening to my father brag to his friends about how cultured Leo had become. I realized then that I was not just the daughter. I was the invisible support column. I was the one ensuring the house did not collapse while they threw extravagant parties in the ballroom. My father's philosophy of self-reliance only ever applied to me. For Leo, there was always a bailout, a second chance, a new car, or a fresh start. I became an expert in structural engineering because I had to learn how to keep myself upright in a house that was constantly leaning against me. As I crossed the state line into California, the memories begin to shift from the pain of the past to the cold, hard logic of the present. I think back to those nights under the flashlight, and I see now that they were not just about saving money on electricity. They were the moments I was building my own internal foundation. I was learning that a structure built on a lie, like the lie that Leo was the successful one, cannot stand indefinitely. My father thought he was teaching me humility, but he was actually teaching me how to survive without him. He thought he was giving Leo the world, but he was actually ensuring that Leo would never know how to build one for himself. The rusted beams I saw back then have finally given way, and as I drive toward San Francisco, I am no longer the girl with the flashlight. I am the woman who knows exactly how to build a skyscraper that can withstand any storm, starting with the one I just walked out of. The Connecticut Colonial looked majestic from the curb, a white-sided monument to my father's supposed success. But as a structural engineer, I knew the secrets hidden behind the fresh coat of paint. For the last 10 years, that house hadn't been standing on my father's merit. It had been standing on my silence and my paycheck. I remember the spring 3 years ago when the slate roof began to weep, water staining the ceiling of the master bedroom like a spreading bruise. My father, Arthur, had stood in the driveway, looking up with a confused frown, blaming the unusual humidity instead of the 30-year-old shingles that had long since reached their breaking point. He didn't reach for his checkbook. He reached for the phone to call me. He didn't ask if I could help. He told me the house was an investment in the family legacy, and that as the one with the good, steady job, it was only logical that I manage the restoration. I spent $12,000 that month. $12,000 that was supposed to be my down payment on a place of my own, to ensure the ceiling didn't collapse on him while he slept. There was no thank you, no mention of my name when he bragged to the neighbors about the extensive renovations he had overseen. To him, my financial support was a default setting, a structural necessity as invisible and unappreciated as the rebar in a concrete slab. The exploitation wasn't limited to the physical walls. It seeped into the very atmosphere of the home, disguised as family duty. When my mother's health began to falter 2 years ago, the medical bills arrived like a relentless tide. Arthur would leave them stacked on the kitchen island, right where I dropped my keys after a 10-hour day at the firm. He never said a word, but the expectation was as heavy as a lead weight. I paid for the co-pays, the specialized physical therapy, and the prescriptions that cost $400 a bottle, all while Leo was posting photos of his entrepreneurial research trip to Las Vegas. I was the stable one, which in Arthur's vocabulary meant the one who could be bled dry without making a scene. I felt like a piling driven deep into the earth, holding up a structure that didn't even acknowledge my existence until the ground started to shake. I watched my bank account plateau while my father's pride soared, fueled by the illusion that he was a self-made man of means. The irony was suffocating. I was the architect of their comfort, yet I was treated like a tenant who was lucky to be allowed in the building. Every time I tried to bring up the future or my own needs, Arthur would deflect with a masterclass in emotional gaslighting. He would talk about how some people were built for the spotlight, like Leo, while others were the steady, quiet force that kept the world turning. It was a beautifully wrapped way of telling me that my only value lay in my utility. I was the person they called when the basement flooded, when the tax bill was overdue, or when the air conditioning unit breathed its last rattling breath. I was the one who knew the exact location of the main water shutoff valve and the precise code for the alarm system, while Leo didn't even know how to change a light bulb without calling a contractor on Dad's dime. I was the invisible foundation, the one part of the building that no one ever looks at until it fails. And I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that I had spent my entire adult life reinforcing a house that was never meant to be mine. The realization hit me one evening as I stood in the basement, looking at the rusted support jacks I had installed myself to level the sagging kitchen floor. If I walked away, if I pulled my financial and physical support, this entire facade would buckle under the weight of its own incompetence. Arthur had no savings, no retirement plan, and a son who viewed money as a renewable resource provided by the universe. They were living in a house of cards, and I was the glue holding it together. I felt a strange sense of liberation in that moment, a shift in my own internal equilibrium. I wasn't just tired. I was finished. I had spent years worrying about the structural failure of my family, but as I looked at the rusted steel in my basement, I realized that the failure had already happened. The house was already condemned. I was just the only one who had read the inspection report. It was time to stop being the mortar for a wall that was designed to shut me out, and time to start building a foundation on ground that I actually owned. 7 months after that frozen night in Connecticut, the view from my office on the 42nd floor of a San Francisco skyscraper was a study in structural resilience. The Golden Gate Bridge emerged from the morning fog like a promise kept, its orange-red steel a testament to the fact that anything can be built to withstand the elements if the engineering is sound. I was no longer the invisible daughter fixing leaky roofs. I was a lead structural consultant specializing in seismic retrofitting, a woman whose job was to ensure that the massive towers of this city did not crumble when the earth decided to shake. My life had become a series of million-dollar projects and precise calculations, a sharp contrast to the chaotic emotional debt I had left behind 3,000 miles away. In the crisp, cool air of the West Coast, I had finally found the space to breathe without the suffocating weight of my father's expectations pressing down on my shoulders. Every morning, I walked into a glass-walled office where my name was etched on the door, not out of family obligation, but because I was the best person for the job. Healing, I discovered, was much like repairing a damaged skyscraper. You had to start with the core. I spent my Tuesday evenings in a quiet, sun-drenched office in Pacific Heights, sitting across from a therapist who helped me dismantle the old, faulty wiring of my psyche. We talked about load-bearing guilt and the necessity of expansion joints in human relationships, the vital gaps that allow for movement and growth without causing a total collapse. I learned that saying no was not an act of rebellion, but an essential structural requirement for my own mental health. For the first time in my life, I was investing my emotional capital in myself, rather than pouring it into the bottomless pit of my brother's incompetence or my father's vanity. My bank account was no longer a communal fund for the Collins family emergencies. It was a fortress of my own making, providing a sense of financial security that made the American dream feel like a tangible reality rather than a dangling carrot. I had replaced that cheap plastic piggy bank with a diversified portfolio and the genuine respect of my professional peers. There was a profound satisfaction in the intellectual stimulation that came with my new daily routine, a kind of mental therapy through precision. I spent hours analyzing blueprints and running complex computer simulations, finding peace in the absolute logic of mathematics, where 2 + 2 always equaled 4. Unlike the twisted arithmetic of my childhood, where my 30 years of sacrifice somehow equaled only $2. I was designing buildings that could flex and sway during a massive quake, absorbing kinetic energy and remaining standing while everything around them trembled. I realized that I had become that very building, resilient, flexible, and grounded in a foundation that was no longer dependent on anyone else's approval. My clothes were sharper, my voice was steadier, and the deep-seated fatigue that had lived in my bones for a decade had finally evaporated. I had successfully re-engineered my entire existence, moving from a position of forced humility to one of earned authority in a city that valued innovation over inheritance. The city of San Francisco was the perfect backdrop for my rebirth, a place built on the ruins of its own history, much like I was. I enjoyed the quiet anonymity of the fog and the bustling energy of the financial district, where I was judged solely on the integrity of my designs and the strength of my calculations. My weekends were no longer spent managing Arthur's tax bills or Leo's latest legal scrapes. Instead, I visited art galleries, hiked the Marin headlands, and learned to appreciate the silence of a life without conflict. I had built a new circle of friends, people who valued self-reliance and hard work as much as I did. We discussed urban planning and seismic safety over artisanal coffee, and not once did I feel the need to apologize for my success or minimize my achievements. I was finally the architect of my own happiness, laying down a foundation of self-respect that was reinforced with every independent decision I made. One Friday afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold, my phone vibrated on the polished mahogany of my desk. I was just finishing a final review of a report on a new high-rise in the Mission District, my mind occupied with wind load stresses and foundation depths. I glanced at the screen, expecting a call from a contractor or a colleague regarding a site inspection. Instead, the area code on the display was 860, the unmistakable signature of Connecticut. It was a number I did not recognize, but the digital ghost of my past felt like a sudden, sharp tremor in an otherwise stable structure. For a moment, the high-rise office seemed to fade, and I was back in that cold living room holding a plastic pig, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the solid floor beneath my expensive heels and the strength in my own hands. I did not feel the old panic or the familiar, frantic urge to fix whatever was broken on the other end of the line. I looked at the shimmering bridge in the distance, and realized that I was finally on the other side of the canyon. I reached out and tapped the screen. The silence of the room amplified as I prepared to hear the first echoes of the collapse I had predicted months ago. The voice on the other end of the line was not my father's, but rather the shaky, frantic tone of Aunt Martha, the self-appointed historian of the Collins family grapevine. I listened in silence, my back against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office, as she poured out a torrent of Connecticut tragedy that sounded less like a series of misfortunes and more like the inevitable collapse of a poorly engineered bridge. She spoke in hushed, hurried whispers about Leo, the golden son whose business venture had turned out to be nothing more than a hollow shell fueled by vanity and high-interest loans. The silver BMW, the coronation gift that had been the center of that bitter Christmas morning, was gone, repossessed by the bank after 3 months of missed payments. Leo hadn't just failed, he had imploded, dragging the family's remaining credit through the mud of his own making, leaving a trail of debt that Aunt Martha described as a total catastrophe. But the cracks didn't stop with my brother's ego. They had spread to the very cornerstone of the family. My father, Arthur, the man who once stood by the fireplace with the air of an untouchable king, had been forced into an early, involuntary retirement following a corporate restructuring that found no use for his outdated methods. Without his steady income, and with Leo's debts mounting like a rising tide, the tax authorities had finally come knocking at the door of the colonial house I had spent thousands of my own dollars to maintain. Martha whispered that they were facing a tax lien, and the prestige my father had so desperately cultivated was evaporating into the cold Connecticut air. They had tried to call me for months, she said, her voice dripping with a subtle, manipulative guilt. But they found themselves hitting a wall of silence. My wall. They needed their stable girl back. They needed the mobile credit card to return and shore up the crumbling structure before the roof literally and figuratively caved in. I listened to her list of grievances with a clinical, almost detached calm, my mind instinctively drawing a stress test diagram of their situation. To Martha, this was a series of cruel twists of fate, but to me, it was simply the math finally adding up. A structure built on favoritism, financed by someone else's sacrifice, and inhabited by people who refused to understand the physics of responsibility, was always destined for this moment. I didn't feel a surge of joy or a thirst for revenge. I felt the cold satisfaction of a professional who had predicted a structural failure and was now watching the data points confirm the hypothesis. I had been the only load-bearing element in that house, and when I removed myself 7 months ago, the collapse became a mathematical certainty. The logic was flawless. You cannot build a legacy on the back of a person you refuse to value. Elena, honey, your father is just... he's a broken man, Martha pleaded, her voice cracking as she tried to find a way through my silence. She talked about family duty and the responsibility I had to the home that raised me, using the same old language of manipulation that had kept me trapped for 30 years. But I wasn't that girl with the plastic piggy bank anymore. I was a woman who knew the exact cost of a foundation and the worth of the person who lays it. I realized that they didn't miss me. They missed the safety net I provided. They didn't want my presence. They wanted my paycheck to fix the rusted beams of their own choices. I waited until she ran out of breath, the silence on the line stretching across the continent until it became a physical barrier. "I hear you, Martha," I said finally, my voice as steady and unyielding as the steel in the bridge outside my window. There was no anger in my tone, only the finality of an inspection report that had already been filed. I told her that I was aware of the situation and that I would be returning to Connecticut briefly for the upcoming family gathering before Leo's planned wedding, an event that now seemed like a desperate attempt to project a stability they no longer possessed. Martha's voice lifted with a sudden desperate hope, thinking the support beam was finally coming back to hold them up one last time. She didn't understand that I wasn't coming back to fix the building. I was coming back to witness the final demolition and to ensure that my own name was permanently removed from the title of their disaster. I hung up the phone, the sun setting over San Francisco, and began to prepare for the return of a woman they wouldn't even recognize. The flight back to Connecticut felt like traveling through a geological era, moving from the stable, earthquake-resistant landscape of my new life back toward a site of imminent structural failure. When I pulled the rented black sedan into the driveway of the Collins estate, the house didn't look like the sanctuary of my childhood. It looked like a building waiting for a condemnation notice. The white paint was beginning to flake away in long, jagged strips near the eaves, and the lawn, once Arthur's pride and joy, was overgrown and choked with weeds, a clear sign that the maintenance budget had vanished along with the family's integrity. I stepped out of the car, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal gray wool suit, tailored with a precision that would make a drafting compass blush. I wasn't wearing the soft, apologetic fabrics of the daughter who used to disappear into the background. I was wearing armor designed for a boardroom. I looked at the house with the cold, detached eye of a lead consultant arriving at a disaster site, noting every sagging timber and every rusted gutter as a data point in a long history of neglect. The pre-wedding gathering was already in full swing when I entered the foyer, the air thick with the smell of cheap sparkling wine and the desperate, forced laughter of people trying to ignore a looming bankruptcy. Leo was there, standing by the makeshift bar with a gin and tonic in his hand, looking like a man who was trying to toast his own funeral. He had lost the smug, golden boy luster of the previous Christmas. His face was puffy, and his eyes darted around the room as if he were looking for an exit or a creditor. When he saw me, he didn't offer a brotherly hug. He offered a look of ravenous hope, the kind of look a drowning man gives to a life raft. My mother hovered in the background, her face a map of silent apologies. But it was my father's reaction that truly marked the shift in the room's equilibrium. Arthur Collins didn't stride toward me with the air of an untouchable king. He shuffled, his shoulders slightly stooped, as if the invisible weight he had spent 30 years piling onto me had finally settled onto his own back. "Elena," he said. His voice lacked the booming resonance of authority I had grown up fearing. It sounded brittle, like old parchment left out in the sun. He looked at my suit, my watch, and the steady, unblinking way I held his gaze, and I could see the gears of his mind turning, trying to calculate how much my professional success could be converted into a bailout for his son's failures. The family looked at me with a collective, suffocating expectancy, treating my return as the arrival of a savior who would simply sign a few checks and restore the facade of their American dream. They didn't see the woman who had spent 7 months in San Francisco dismantling the emotional scaffolding they had built around her. They saw a fixed asset that had finally come home to be liquidated. I moved through the room with a professional distance, accepting their shallow greetings with a polite, razor-sharp smile that didn't reach my eyes, maintaining the silence of the abyss that I had perfected since the night of the plastic pig. The irony was as thick as the Connecticut humidity. This was the family that told me women were the mortar and men were the bricks. Yet here were the bricks, crumbling into red dust, while the mortar had walked away and built a skyscraper. Every corner of the house reminded me of a bill I had paid or a repair I had managed in the dark. And seeing the current state of decay felt like reading a final inspection report that confirmed my earlier suspicions. I didn't feel the old frantic urge to grab a toolbox or open my checkbook. I felt a profound, crystalline clarity. I was no longer a part of this building's load-bearing system. I was a visitor, an observer, an expert in structural failure who had come to witness the inevitable result of a faulty design. The house felt small, its ceilings low and oppressive, a relic of a past that no longer had any power over my present. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the peeling wallpaper of the dining room, Arthur caught my eye and gestured toward the library with a trembling hand. It was the same room where he had told me 18 years ago that I needed to be humble while Leo needed to be cultured. "Elena, we need to talk about the family's stability," he whispered, his eyes pleading for a mercy he had never shown me. He didn't ask how I was or what my life in San Francisco was like. He went straight for the structural integrity of his own pride. I nodded, my expression unreadable, and followed him into the library. I felt the weight of the thick folder in my briefcase, the receipts of 10 years of my life. And I knew that the conversation we were about to have would not be about stability, but about the final, irreversible demolition of his manipulation. The library smelled of dust and decaying leather, a fitting mausoleum for the outdated philosophies my father still tried to peddle as wisdom. Arthur sat behind his heavy oak desk, attempting to summon the ghost of his former authority, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. He began with the practiced, talking about the unforeseen market shifts and the temporary setbacks Leo had faced, framing my brother's systemic incompetence as a mere streak of bad luck. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into that familiar, patronizing register, and told me that as the one who had always been stable and successful, the family, which really meant his own pride, now needed me to shore up its crumbling foundation. He didn't ask about my life in San Francisco or the towers I had built. He simply reached out a hand, expecting me to fill it with the financial salvation he felt entitled to. I watched him with the cold, unblinking precision of a structural inspector, seeing every crack in his facade. I didn't interrupt him. I let him exhaust his script of manipulation until the silence in the room became a heavy, suffocating pressure. When he finally finished, I didn't reach for a checkbook. I reached for my professional briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized folder. I didn't offer words of comfort. I offered data. I opened the ledger to the first tab, where I had chronicled 10 years of my life in black and white. I began to read the numbers with a flat, clinical tone that echoed off the mahogany bookshelves. I listed the $12,000 I spent on the roof while Leo was on a 6-week tour of Europe, and the $15,000 in medical copays I covered for my mother while my father was buying Leo a tailored suit for a job interview he never showed up for. I detailed the mortgage arrears I had quietly settled 3 years ago, and the $5,000 I had funneled into the basement structural repairs that Arthur had claimed as his own handiwork. Every cent was accounted for, cross-referenced with the dates of Leo's repossessed BMW payments and his failed startup costs. I was no longer the daughter providing a safety net. I was the auditor conducting a final review of a bankrupt estate. Arthur's face, which had been flushed with the hope of a bailout, began to drain of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray as the sheer volume of my invisible contributions was laid bare on the desk between us. He tried to stammer a protest, mentioning again how he had always ensured I had everything I needed to be independent. I looked him dead in the eye and repeated his own words back to him with a quiet, lethal intensity, telling him that he was right. I did have everything. I told him I had the grit he tried to break, the education I had paid for with my own sweat, and the professional integrity that he had never bothered to cultivate in his golden son. I pointed to the total figure at the bottom of the ledger, a number that represented a decade of my stolen youth and unacknowledged labor, and told him that this was the cost of the stability he was now begging for. The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of the truth finally collapsing the hollow structure of his authority. The air in the library felt thin, as if the lies that had sustained the room for 30 years had finally been sucked out. Arthur looked down at the documents, his hands no longer trembling with age, but with a sudden, terrifying realization that his power over me had been an illusion based on my own willingness to be used. He wasn't looking at a daughter he could manipulate. He was looking at a creditor who was finished with the debt. I felt a profound sense of intellectual satisfaction as I watched him struggle to find a counter-argument to the cold, hard logic of the numbers. There were no expansion joints left in our relationship, no room for him to sway or flex his way back into my life. I stood up slowly, the leather of my chair creaking like a warning sign, and prepared to deliver the final structural verdict on the House of Collins. The silence that followed the revelation of my ledger was heavy, a suffocating atmospheric pressure that felt like the moments before a massive structural failure. Arthur's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his own reflection shatter in real time, the arithmetic of his own failure finally catching up to him. I reached back into my briefcase, but this time I did not pull out a document or a blueprint. I pulled out the translucent pink plastic piggy bank, the one from the clearance bin at Walmart, the one that had been my only Christmas gift. I placed it slowly, deliberately, on top of the ledger I had just used to dismantle his pride. The 2 lonely $1 bills rattled against the cheap plastic, a hollow, tinny sound that seemed to fill every corner of the mahogany-paneled room. "You told me last Christmas that I was the stable one, Father," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a 1,000-ton support beam. "You said this was a symbol of the thriftiness that made me successful. Well, I have done the math. I have calculated the stress-strain curve of this family for 30 years, and the results are finally in. This structure is not just leaning, it is architecturally bankrupt. Leo appeared at the library door, his tie loosened and his face pale, sensing the shift in the house's atmosphere like an animal sensing an incoming storm. He looked from the ledger to the plastic pig, then to our father's defeated posture. He opened his mouth to ask for help, probably for another loan or a signature on a bail bond. But the words died in his throat when I turned my gaze toward him. I did not see a golden brother anymore. I saw a faulty component, a rusted bolt that had finally caused the entire system to fail. I looked back at Arthur and shoved the piggy bank toward him across the polished desk. This is the final dividend on my investment in the Collins family, I told him, each word a sharp, clean strike of a hammer. Consider this Leo's seed money for his next disaster. You said I was stable, so believe me when I tell you as an expert. I no longer owe this house, or either of you, a single ounce of support. My final inspection is complete, and I am officially marking this building as condemned. I stood up, the silence of the room now feeling like a liberation rather than a burden. I did not need an apology, and I did not need him to understand the depth of my pain. I only needed the truth to be the last thing left standing between us. Arthur looked at the plastic pig as if it were a ticking bomb, his hands finally dropping to his sides in a gesture of total surrender. He had spent a lifetime trying to convince me that my value was found in my utility. But in that moment, he realized that my utility was the only thing that had kept him relevant. I did not look back to see the expression on Leo's face, or the tears that were finally beginning to well in my father's eyes. I walked out of the library and through the foyer of the house I had spent a decade holding together, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, confident finality. This was the ASMR for the brain I had promised myself. The clean, sharp sound of a woman walking away from a debt she never truly owed. I stepped out into the cool Connecticut evening, the air tasting of freedom and the sharp, honest scent of coming winter. Behind me, the white-sided colonial stood silent, a beautiful facade that was now hollow to the core, a monument to the American dream that had curdled into a nightmare of entitlement. I climbed into my car, the engine purring to life with a reliability that my family could never offer, and I drove away from the ruins. I was not just leaving a house. I was leaving a cage I had built for myself out of duty and false hope. As I turned onto the main road toward the airport, I felt the immense, terrifying, and beautiful lightness of a woman who had finally realized that the only foundation that ever truly mattered was the one she had built within herself. The $2 in that pig were not a gift, and they were not an insult. They were the price of my total and absolute independence. The flight back to the West Coast felt like shedding a skin that had grown too tight, a heavy layer of duty and disappointment that I finally left in the trash bin of a Connecticut airport. 6 months have passed since I placed that plastic pig on my father's desk, and the silence from that side of the country has been the most beautiful symphony I have ever heard. I am standing on the balcony of my new apartment in Pacific Heights, watching the fog roll over the San Francisco Bay in soft, gray ribbons. Below me, the Golden Gate Bridge glows in the twilight, its massive orange towers anchored deep into the rock, a perfect metaphor for the life I have finally engineered for myself. I no longer feel the phantom weight of the Connecticut house on my shoulders, and the load-bearing guilt that defined my 20s has been replaced by the light, airy grace of a structure that knows exactly how to carry its own mass. My apartment is a sanctuary of glass and steel, filled with books I actually want to read and art that I chose myself. A private skyscraper built on the solid foundation of my own self-respect. Beside me, a man named Mark sets down 2 glasses of wine, his hand brushing mine with a warmth that is grounded in genuine respect, not a desperate need for a bailout. He is an architect who understands that the strongest connections are the ones where both sides stand on their own feet. And for the first time in 40 years, I am in a relationship where I am valued for who I am, not for what I can fix. We do not talk about the ruins I left behind. We talk about the future, about sustainable designs and the way light hits the water at dawn. The stable girl is gone, replaced by a woman who is vibrant, independent, and entirely whole. There is a profound, healing peace in knowing that I am no longer a safety net for people who refuse to learn how to fly. As the cool Pacific breeze catches the copper wind chimes on the terrace, the gentle, melodic ringing sounds like a final door closing on the old chapter of my life. I take a sip of wine and look out at the horizon, realizing that while the house in Connecticut may be crumbling, my own tower is just beginning to reach the clouds. I sit at my drafting table, the mahogany surface cool and solid under my palms, a stark contrast to the flimsy card tables of my youth. The city lights of San Francisco shimmer like a sea of fallen stars outside my window, but my focus is inward, on a single sheet of cream-colored vellum. I find myself writing a letter, not to the father who tried to break me or the brother who tried to bleed me dry, but to the girl I was at 18. I want to tell her, that exhausted girl smelling of diner grease and desperation, that every hour spent under a flickering flashlight was a brick in a fortress no one could ever take away. I want her to know that the silence of the library in Connecticut wasn't a vacuum of love, but a space where she was quietly forging a soul of tempered steel. Looking back from the vantage point of 40 years, I realized that my father's cruelty was, in a twisted and unintended way, the most effective structural test I ever endured. He thought he was denying me a future, but he was actually granting me the rarest gift of all, the absolute necessity of self-reliance. I take a moment to look at a small framed photo on my desk, not of a person, but of a blueprint for a bridge that can sway 30 inches in either direction without snapping. It reminds me of the $2 that once sat in a plastic pig. I see now that those $2 weren't an insult. They were the purchase price of my total and absolute liberty. Had my father given me the BMW or the easy path, I might have become like Leo, a hollow structure, gilded on the outside but crumbling at the first sign of a tremor. Instead, the rusted beams of my upbringing forced me to dig deeper, to find the bedrock of my own character, and to build a foundation that didn't require anyone else's permission to exist. I feel a strange, quiet pity for Arthur and Leo now, a detachment that is far more powerful than anger. They are still trapped in that sagging colonial house, trying to maintain a facade of prestige while the taxes go unpaid and the roof continues to weep. They are the ones who are truly impoverished, living in a world where value is measured in logos and leather seats rather than integrity and sweat. The American dream, I've realized, isn't about what is handed to you on Christmas morning. It's about the skyscraper you build out of the scraps you were left with. I fold the letter and tuck it into my old design journal, a legacy of self-worth that I will carry into every project I touch. I am no longer the daughter waiting for a seat at a table that was never built for her. I am the architect of the table, the room, and the entire building. There is a profound sense of healing in this realization, a closing of a circle that began with a plastic pig and ended with a skyline of my own making. I feel the weight of my life, and for the first time, it doesn't feel like a burden. It feels like momentum. I stand up and walk back to the window, watching a lone freighter glide under the bridge, heading out toward the vast, open potential of the Pacific. Tomorrow, I start a new project, a community center in a neighborhood that has seen too much collapse and not enough construction. I plan to build it with the strongest expansion joints I can design, ensuring it can handle whatever the earth throws at it. I smile, a genuine private expression of triumph, knowing that I am finally the master of my own stresses and strains. The stable girl from Connecticut is gone, replaced by a woman who knows that as long as her internal foundation is true, she can withstand any storm. The story of the Collins family is a closed book, a blueprint for what happens when you build on a lie. But my story is a continuous, soaring line, reaching for a horizon that is finally, beautifully, mine. Elena's story reminds us that we are not responsible for fixing structures we didn't break. Seeing her walk away with her head held high, knowing her worth isn't measured by a parent's favor, truly touched my heart. To all the stable daughters out there, your reliability is a gift, but it shouldn't be your prison. Building your own foundation is the greatest act of self-love. You are enough, just as you are. How did Elena's journey make you feel today? Is there a $2 moment in your life that changed everything? Share your wisdom with us in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for listening to Rose Revenge. Until next time, take care of your heart.